The novels we've read so far have long been a part of the literary canon in England. Now, we're moving on to a novel that has been recently rediscovered: The Woman of Color, A Tale. It was first published in 1808, and despite a favorable critical reception at the time, there was no second edition. This book was forgotten for 200 years, and we only got access to it again thanks to this splendid critical edition by Lyndon Dominic for the Broadview Press, and it came out exactly 200 years after the first publication. We don't know who wrote it. One exciting possibility is that it may have been written by a woman of color. But despite the uncertainty about the authorship, this book is a landmark in the history of black representation in British literature. This is the first novel to have been published in Britain to have featured a woman of African descent as the main character. And it's a novel that places issues of race and identity at the very heart of the narrative. The heroine, Olivia Fairfield, was born in Jamaica to an English plantation owner and an enslaved African woman, Marcia. At the beginning of the novel, both of her parents are dead, and we find Olivia on a ship heading towards England. According to her father's will, Olivia was to inherit £60,000, but only if she married her cousin, a white Englishman called Augustus Morton. Olivia and Augustus have never met, and she's worried that she may not like him, or that he may reject her on account of her race. If the marriage doesn't happen, then the money will go to Augustus's older brother George, who's already married, and George would be responsible for taking Olivia under his protection. She's afraid of being under the mercy of a stranger and his wife, and you'll see that she had good reasons for that. The story is told from Olivia's point of view in letters that she's sending back to her governess, who's still in Jamaica. And these letters give us a critical depiction of English society as seen through the eyes of a woman of color. Now, these terms, woman of color or person of color, had a different meaning than it does today. As used in Britain in the 18th century, it referred to free, non-white women and men from the British colonies. This is to say that the term did not apply to black people deprived of their freedom. It did not apply, for example, to Olivia's mother, Marcia, even though she was black, because she was a victim of enslavement in Jamaica. But it did apply to Olivia herself, who was raised as a free woman by an affluent English slaveholder. When Olivia moves to England, she is entering a very different world than the one she knows. Think of the world of Jane Austen's novels. And yet, because of her education as a free woman, she very much understands the codes of behavior that regulate that society. She's highly educated, she's highly proper, she dresses elegantly, and she has all the good manners required by that kind of polite society. And yet, Olivia's skin color makes her a noticeable outsider in that world. And this novel does a wonderful job of exploring the tensions that result from racial difference, and also of portraying that familiar society that we know from other novels through a very different pair of eyes, the eyes of a black woman. Now, how unique was Olivia's situation? Were there black people in England at the times of Jane Austen? If we were to judge from most period pieces and novel adaptations, we might be tempted to say no. The image we get of the English population from such sources is, without exception, white. And yet, black people had been present in Britain for centuries. In fact, they'd been there since Roman times. The English historian Miranda Kaufmann has documented their lives in the 1600s in Britain during Tudor times. And their presence intensified towards the end of the 18th century, since after the wars of American independence, many black men who had served as sailors and soldiers emigrated to England. In 1808, when The Woman of Color came out, there were approximately 20,000 people of African descent living in England. You can trace their presence by looking at paintings from the times, including portraits of famous authors such as Ignatius Sancho, Olaudah Equiano, and the poet Phillis Wheatley. A particularly striking painting is this one, painted by David Martin in 1779. You recognize it from the cover image of our edition of The Woman of Color. Dido Elizabeth Bell and Elizabeth Murray were cousins, raised together by one of the most famous jurists in England, William Murray, the Earl of Mansfield. Dido was the illegitimate daughter of Lord Mansfield's son, and she was brought to England as a child to be raised by her grandparents. And what makes this painting striking is that Dido is not hidden in the background of the picture. She is in full view like her white cousin. This was rare, and the painting so impressed the director Ama Asante that she decided to make a movie about Dido. It's a beautiful movie called Belle, and it came out in 2013. If you want to get a sense of the universe that Olivia is encountering in The Woman of Color, I encourage you to watch it. If you want to learn more about the history of Black British people, you may consult projects such as the website The Black Presence in Britain or the University of London's Black British History Project. Now, while people of color in the modern sense of that word were common in England around the turn of the 18th century, not many of them shared Olivia and Dido's gender and social status. As I mentioned earlier, many of them had come to England as soldiers or sailors, and most were men, not women. In addition, many had been brought to England under enslavement, and once in England, they suffered under a rather ambiguous legal status. Britain owed its imperial riches to the Atlantic slave trade and to the ruthless and continued enslavement of Africans and their descendants in its colonies overseas, Jamaica included, but it had no clear rules regarding slavery when it came to its own territory. Was slavery allowed at all on British soil? People did keep slaves on British soil, but whether that was legal or not was highly unclear. What is called statute law, which is laws actually passed by the British Parliament, contained no provisions regarding the status of slavery on British soil. And what is called common law, which is laws based on custom or precedents, did contain those provisions, but they were highly inconsistent. A succession of decisions by English judges oscillated between determining that slavery was legal and that it was not. Beginning in the 16th century, find judgments determining that the air of England is too pure for slavery, that a black man becomes free the moment he steps into England, that enslaved people are property, and again that to set foot in England is to be free. A particularly important decision was taken in 1772 by Lord Mansfield, the same Lord Mansfield who raised Dido Elizabeth Bell. It is known as the Somerset case. It has involved the right to freedom of an African man called James Somerset, who had been enslaved in Virginia and had escaped once brought to England. Lord Mansfield's decision was as follows. The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons moral or political. It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England. According to this ruling, slavery is unacceptable on moral grounds, but unfortunately can be legal as long as there are laws authorizing it. But since there are no such laws, slavery is unacceptable in England. This decision on the Somerset case is a landmark in the campaign against slavery in England, and it's often considered to be the beginning of a longer and slow process of abolition. But things were not as simple. Even after the Mansfield decision, black people in England continued to be threatened, abused, and sold into slavery, as we can tell from ads like these ones. The late 18th century nonetheless witnessed a growing wave of abolitionist sentiment in Britain under the leadership of both black and white abolitionists. Men and women like Olaudah Equiano, Kwabena Otoba Kugowano, Hannah More, and William Wilberforce. Together, they founded abolitionist societies, published abolitionist texts, and they initiated and sent hundreds of petitions to the British Parliament. The slave trade was only abolished in Britain in 1807, and then the institution of slavery itself was abolished much later in 1833 in the British colonies. These are important dates for understanding The Woman of Color. The novel again was published in 1808, just a year after the abolition of the slave trade. People were interested in the topic, and this novel makes a powerful case for going beyond abolishing the trade and actually emancipating victims of enslavement in the British colonies. Olivia herself, as a free woman, does not need to fear for her freedom, but she does not come to England alone. She brings with her a formerly enslaved black woman suggestively called Dido. And Dido has a different status in England, and that leads her to being treated rather differently than Olivia is. Is Dido a slave? That's one of the intriguing questions that this novel raises. Taken together, these two women, separated by class, but united by race, offer us a complex portrayal of 18th century colonialism and racism. What should you be reading for? I would be especially interested in your impressions of two things. First, Olivia's attitude towards her past life in Jamaica, and especially her attitude towards her parents. And second, her impressions of England. That's it for now. Have fun.